Sarah Whitmore realized she'd made a terrible mistake. She stood in the middle of Bitterroot, Montana, clutching a worn leather satchel and a letter that had promised her a new life. The town consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a dirt road that disappeared into endless prairie grass. Behind her, the stagecoach driver tossed down her trunk with a thud that seemed to echo her sinking heart. "This is it, miss," he said, not unkindly. "End of the line." Sarah was 22 years old and had never been more than 10 miles from Boston until 3 weeks ago. Now she stood in a place so foreign it might as well have been the moon, waiting for a man she'd never met to claim her as his bride. The arrangement had been made through letters, carefully worded advertisements, and the desperate circumstances of her aunt's death that had left her alone in the world. Marriage to a Montana rancher had seemed like an adventure when she'd been sitting in her aunt's cramped boarding house room. Now it seemed like madness. "You Whitmore's mail-order bride?" A voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to find a woman with steel-grey hair and a face weathered by sun and wind standing in the doorway of the general store. "Don't just stand there gaping. Come inside before you get sunstroke." The woman's name was Martha Henderson, and she ran the store with the efficient practicality of someone who'd survived 30 Montana winters. She poured Sarah a cup of water from a pitcher and studied her with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "James didn't mention you'd be quite so young," Martha said, not disapprovingly, just stating fact. "Or quite so fancy." Sarah glanced down at her traveling dress, already dusty from the journey. It was the plainest thing she owned, but she supposed it did look fancy compared to Martha's simple calico. The advertisement said he was looking for a wife to help run his ranch. "I can work hard." "Can you cook over an open fire? Mend harness leather? Help birth a calf?" Martha's questions weren't meant to be cruel, but each one landed like a stone in Sarah's stomach. "Child, what did you think you were coming here to do?" Before Sarah could answer, the door swung open and a man stepped inside, and the entire world seemed to shift beneath her feet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of a summer storm. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. When he saw her, he stopped dead in his tracks. "You're Sarah," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm James Holloway." He removed his hat, and she noticed his hands were large and scarred from work, the hands of a man who built things and fixed things and wrestled with the land itself. "I apologize for not meeting your stage. We had trouble with some cattle breaking through a fence." They stood looking at each other while Martha watched with barely concealed interest. Sarah had expected someone older, harder, maybe cruel. The letters had been practical, almost businesslike, but the man before her had kindness in his eyes, even as uncertainty flickered there too. He seemed as unsure of this arrangement as she was. "You came a long way," James said finally. "I want you to know that you're not bound to anything until you've seen the place and decided if you can make a life here. I won't force you into marriage if Montana isn't what you expected." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense she nearly swayed on her feet. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's very generous." "It's only fair." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Come on, I'll take you to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride." The ranch house sat in a valley between rolling hills, covered in grass that moved like ocean waves in the constant wind. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a solid log structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Behind it stood a barn, a corral with horses and outbuildings she couldn't identify. The land stretched in every direction, vast and empty and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "It's 5,000 acres, James said as he helped her down from the wagon. "My father homesteaded here 20 years ago. He died last winter, left it to me." He gestured toward the house. There's a woman who comes twice a week to help with cooking and cleaning, but mostly I've been managing alone. That's why I—" He trailed off, seeming embarrassed. "Why you needed a wife," Sarah finished for him. She understood necessity. It was necessity that had brought her here. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, furnished with handmade furniture and lacking any of the small touches that made a space feel like a home. James showed her to a small bedroom off the main living area. "You'll stay here until we figure things out," he said. "I sleep in the loft. There's a lock on your door, if it makes you more comfortable." That night, Sarah lay in the narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana wilderness. Wind rattling the windows, the distant call of a coyote, the creak of the house settling. She thought about James, about the way he'd been careful not to crowd her, the way he'd given her an escape route. She thought about the land, about the emptiness that was somehow full of possibility. And she thought about the future, uncertain and frightening and suddenly not quite as hopeless as it had seemed when she'd first arrived. She didn't know it yet, but James was lying awake in the loft, thinking about her too, thinking about the fear he'd seen in her eyes when she'd first arrived, and the determination that had replaced it when she'd seen the ranch. Thinking about how young she looked, how out of place, and how he'd somehow have to turn this frightened city girl into a rancher's wife. Or let her go, which was perhaps the kinder choice. Neither of them slept much that first night. The rooster crowed before dawn, and Sarah woke to darkness and confusion before remembering where she was. By the time she'd dressed and made her way to the main room, James was already at the stove, making coffee in a battered pot. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Hope you're hungry. We eat early and big around here." He made breakfast with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for himself too long. Eggs, bacon, biscuits that were serviceable if not elegant. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of forks on plates. Sarah watched him covertly, noticing details she'd been too overwhelmed to see yesterday. The way he moved with economy, wasting no motion. The lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he'd smiled yesterday. The wedding ring he still wore on a chain around his neck, visible when his shirt collar gaped open. "You were married before," she said before she could stop herself. James's hand went to the ring. 3 years. She died in childbirth, along with the baby. That was 2 years ago. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but what else could she say? "So am I." He pushed back from the table. "I'm going to check on the cattle in the north pasture. You can stay here, or you can come with me and start learning what ranch life is really about. Your choice." Sarah had never been on a horse in her life, but she lifted her chin and said, "I'll come." The next hours were a revelation. James was patient as he taught her the basics of sitting a horse, of moving with the animal instead of against it. He showed her how to read the land, pointing out landmarks that would help her find her way home if she ever got lost. He explained about water rights and grazing rotation, about predators and weather patterns, about the dozens of skills she'd need to survive here. "A ranch wife isn't just decoration," he said as they paused on a hilltop overlooking his land. "She's a partner. She needs to know everything I know, because there'll be times when I'm not here and decisions need to be made. Times when things go wrong and there's no one else to fix them." "I understand," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she did. "Not fully. Do you?" James turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Because I need to know if you're really willing to do this, to learn everything, to work until you're exhausted, to live a life that's lonely and hard, more often than it's easy. I need to know if you're going to cut and run at the first difficulty, or if you're made of sterner stuff." Something in Sarah sparked at his words. She'd traveled across the country alone, hadn't she? She'd buried her only family and started over with nothing but courage and determination. "I'm made of stern enough stuff," she said quietly. "I just need someone to teach me." James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Let's see what you're capable of." The days that followed fell into a pattern. James woke her before dawn, and they worked until dark, with breaks only for meals. He taught her everything: how to mend fences, how to treat sick animals, how to read weather signs in the sky and know when to bring the cattle in. He taught her to shoot, to rope, to identify poisonous plants and track predators. Her hands blistered and bled, then calloused over. Her muscles ached in places she hadn't known existed. Her skin burned and then tanned, but she learned. God, how she learned. God, how. "You're doing well," Martha told her when she came into town for supplies 2 weeks later. "James says you're picking things up faster than he expected." "He talks about me?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Martha laughed. "Child, you're living in his house. Of course he talks about you. He also talks about how you got up before him yesterday to start breakfast, about how you spotted that broken fence section before he did, about how you didn't complain when that horse threw you into the mud." Sarah remembered that incident with chagrin. She'd been mortified, covered head to toe in muck, but James had just helped her up and said, "Everyone falls. What matters is getting back on." "He's a good man," Martha said, more seriously now. "But he's a careful man, been hurt too much to risk his heart easily. If you want more than just a working arrangement from him, you're going to have to show him you're here to stay." Was that what Sarah wanted? She wasn't sure anymore. The marriage had been about survival, about necessity. But somewhere between the dawn rides and the evening conversations by the fire, something had shifted. She'd started noticing the way James smiled when he was pleased, rare as it was, the way he always made sure she had the better portion at meals, the way he'd put his coat around her shoulders one cold evening without saying a word. That night they sat on the porch after dinner, watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky. James was whittling something, his knife moving with practiced ease through the wood. "What are you making?" Sarah asked. "A spoon. The one we've been using is about worn through." He held it up to show her the emerging shape. "My father taught me. Said a man should be able to make what he needs." "Will you teach me?" He glanced at her, surprised. "If you want." "I want to learn everything," Sarah said. "Everything you know, everything this land requires." James was quiet for a moment, the knife still in his hands. "Why?" he asked finally. "You could leave. I'd pay your way back to Boston. You don't have to stay here and work yourself to exhaustion just to survive." Sarah thought about her answer carefully. "In Boston, I was nobody, an orphan with no prospects, no future. Here," she gestured at the darkening prairie, "here I can be someone who matters, someone who builds something that lasts." "And the marriage?" His voice was carefully neutral. "We've been here 3 weeks and haven't talked about it." Her heart hammered in her chest. "What do you want, James?" "I want—" He set down the knife and the half-formed spoon. "I want to know that you're choosing this, not just accepting it because you have nowhere else to go, not just going through with it because you feel obligated. I want to know that if we stand before a preacher and speak vows, you mean them." Sarah turned to face him fully. "And what about you? Would you mean them?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "I'm not a man who does things halfway. If we marry, I'm all in, for life, through everything this land can throw at us." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. This was it, the moment of decision. She could leave, go back to Boston and try to make some other kind of life. Or she could stay here, marry this man, and claim the future she'd only begun to imagine. "Then teach me," she said. "Teach me everything, and when you think I'm ready, ask me again." The first real test came at the end of Sarah's 4th week on the ranch. She woke to James shaking her shoulder, his face grim in the pre-dawn darkness. "Storm coming," he said. "Big one. We need to get the cattle to the lower pasture before it hits." Sarah had learned enough to know what this meant. The cattle were scattered across the high grazing land, and if the storm caught them there, they could be killed by lightning or scattered by panic. She dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with sleep and urgency, and followed James into the darkness. They worked frantically as the sky grew lighter but more ominous, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. James rode like he was part of the horse, moving the reluctant cattle with practiced skill. Sarah did her best to help, but there were so many animals and so much ground to cover. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer. "We're not going to make it," she shouted over the rising wind. "Yes, we are." James's face was set with determination. "Stay with them. Keep them moving." The first drops of rain hit like bullets. Within seconds it became a deluge. Sarah could barely see through the sheets of water, could barely stay in the saddle as her horse slipped in the suddenly muddy ground. Lightning cracked so close she felt the electricity in the air, and the cattle panicked, breaking into a run. "Let them go!" James materialized beside her through the rain. "Just let them go. Get to the barn." But one calf had stumbled, separated from its mother, bawling in terror. Without thinking, Sarah turned her horse toward it. She heard James shout something, but the words were lost in thunder. She reached the calf, tried to herd it toward safety, but the little animal was too frightened to respond to direction. Lightning struck a tree 50 yards away, splitting it with a crack that made Sarah's horse rear. She grabbed for the saddle horn, missed, and fell hard into the mud. The world spun, pain exploded in her side, and then James was there, pulling her up, half carrying her to the barn as the storm raged around them. Inside, soaked and shaking, Sarah collapsed against a hay bale. James knelt beside her, his hands checking her for injuries with surprising gentleness. "Are you hurt? Did you break anything?" "I don't think so." Her ribs ached where she'd landed, but nothing felt broken. "The calf?" "Forget the calf. You could have been killed." For the first time since she'd met him, James was angry. "What were you thinking going after it like that?" "It needed help," Sarah shot back, her own anger rising to match his. "I couldn't just leave it." "You could have died." He grabbed her shoulders, his face inches from hers. "Do you understand that? That tree could have fallen on you. That lightning could have struck you. You could have been trampled. I was trying to help save your cattle." "I don't care about the damn cattle. I care about—" He stopped abruptly, the words hanging between them. The air in the barn felt charged with more than just the storm's electricity. Sarah's breath caught. "You care about what?" James released her shoulders and stood pacing away. Rain hammered on the barn roof like gunfire. "I care about you being safe," he said finally, his back to her. "I care about you not taking foolish risks. I care about—" He turned back, and the look on his face made her heart skip. "I care about you, Sarah. More than I should. More than is wise." She stood on shaking legs, closing the distance between them. "Why isn't it wise?" "Because you'll leave." His voice was rough. "When you realize how hard this life really is, when you've had enough of the loneliness and the work and the danger, you'll leave, and I'll be the fool who let himself care again." "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "James, I fell off a horse in the middle of a lightning storm, trying to save one of your calves. If that doesn't prove I'm committed to this place, to this life, what will?" "It proves you're brave and stubborn and reckless," he said, but his hand tightened on hers. "It doesn't prove you won't change your mind when winter comes and you're snowed in for weeks at a time, when the isolation makes you forget what the rest of the world looks like." "Then let me prove it." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him despite their wet clothes. "Give me the chance to show you I mean what I say." The storm raged outside, but in the barn everything went still. James raised his free hand to her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "I don't know if I can survive losing someone again," he whispered. "I barely made it through the first time." "You won't lose me." Sarah turned her face into his palm. I promise you won't lose me." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost questioning. But when she kissed him back, something broke open between them. All the careful distance they'd maintained, all the caution and hesitation, dissolved like mist. His arms came around her and she pressed close, feeling his heart hammering against her chest. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, "not because it's an arrangement or a necessity. Marry me because you want to, because you choose this life and choose me." "Yes," the word came easily, certainly. "Yes, I'll marry you." The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. They found the wayward calf safe with its mother, the herd intact in the lower pasture. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular colors across the wet prairie, James rode into town and returned with the preacher. They were married in the ranch house parlor, with Martha and her husband as witnesses. Sarah wore the same traveling dress she'd arrived in, now clean and pressed. James wore his best shirt and the wedding ring from around his neck, ready to place on her finger. The ceremony was simple, the words traditional, but when Sarah spoke her vows and looked into James's eyes, she meant every syllable with her whole heart. "I claim every inch of this life," she said later that night, standing on the porch with her new husband's arm around her waist. "Every challenge, every joy, every piece of this land and this future, as if I've never been anywhere else, as if I was born for this moment." James pulled her close and kissed her temple. "You were," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." The summer passed in a blur of work and discovery. Sarah learned what it meant to be truly married, not just in name, but in every sense. She learned the rhythm of James's breathing as he slept beside her, learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the tone of his voice. She learned that marriage on a ranch wasn't about romance and leisure. It was about working side by side, trusting each other completely, becoming a unit that was stronger than either of them alone. She also learned that James had been right about the isolation. There were days when they didn't see another soul, when the ranch felt like its own small planet spinning alone in the universe. But instead of feeling trapped, Sarah found freedom in it. Freedom to be herself, to work until she was exhausted and triumphant, to build something that mattered. "You're different than you were," Martha observed one day when Sarah came to town for supplies. "Stronger, settled." Sarah laughed, flexing her work-hardened hands. "I've got more calluses than a dock worker." "I'm not talking about your hands." Martha studied her with those shrewd eyes. "You've found where you belong. Not every woman does." It was true. Somewhere between learning to birth a calf and helping James repair the barn roof, between the quiet evenings by the fire and the exhausting days under the sun, Sarah had transformed. She wasn't the frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach. She was a rancher's wife, a partner in every sense of the word. But the biggest test was yet to come. It started with a letter that arrived in late August. James brought it back from town, his face troubled as he handed it to Sarah. The return address was from a law office in Boston. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. She read it once, then again, unable to quite believe the words. "What is it?" James asked. "My aunt." Sarah looked up at him, stunned. "Before she died, she had some money in a trust. The lawyer says I'm entitled to it, $3,000. It was a fortune, more than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to buy passage back to Boston and set herself up comfortably. Enough to leave this hard life behind and return to civilization." James's face went carefully blank. "That's good news." "Is it?" Sarah set the letter down. "James, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that you have choices now." He turned away, looking out the window at the land they'd been working together. "You don't have to stay here and break your back every day. You could go back east, start over with money behind you." The hurt in his voice made her ache. "Do you want me to leave?" "Of course not." He turned back, and she saw the fear in his eyes. "But I won't trap you here either. If you want to go, I don't." Sarah closed the distance between them. "James, listen to me. I don't want that money to buy passage to Boston. I want it to invest in this ranch, in our future. We could expand the herd, repair the irrigation system you've been worried about. Maybe even hire some help so you're not working yourself to death. You'd do that? Give up the chance to leave?" "I'm not giving up anything." She took his hands in hers. "I'm choosing what I want. I'm choosing you and this life and everything we're building together. Can't you see that? Can't you trust that I mean it?" James pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I'm trying," he said against her hair. "God, I'm trying. But I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize you made a mistake. The only mistake would be letting fear stop us from having everything we could have together." Sarah pulled back enough to look up at him. "I love you, James. I think I started falling for you the first time you taught me to sit a horse, when you were patient even though I was terrible at it. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see this land. I love the life we're making, and I'm not going anywhere." The relief on his face was like watching the sun break through clouds. "I love you too," he said, and kissed her like a drowning man finding air. "I've been so scared to say it. Scared that if I admitted how much you mean to me, the universe would take you away." "The universe is going to have to try a lot harder than that," Sarah said when they came up for air. "I'm pretty stubborn, in case you hadn't noticed." They decided to use the money to buy breeding stock and upgrade their equipment. It would mean more work, but also more security. James was skeptical at first, but Sarah could see the hope growing in his eyes as they planned. They were building something real, something that would last. That night, lying in bed with the windows open to catch the cool breeze, James traced lazy patterns on Sarah's arm. "What?" she asked, feeling him watching her. "I'm just thinking about how lucky I am." His voice was soft in the darkness. "I wrote that advertisement expecting practical help. I never thought I'd find—" He trailed off. "Love," Sarah finished for him. "Everything," he corrected. "A true partner. Someone who sees what this land could be and wants to make it happen. Someone who isn't scared of hard work or hard times." He kissed her shoulder. "Someone who fits into my life like you were always meant to be here." "Maybe I was," Sarah said. She thought about the long journey west, about all the choices and circumstances that had brought her to this moment. "Maybe this was always where I was supposed to end up. Even if it means getting thrown in the mud during lightning storms." She laughed and swatted his chest. "Even then, though I'd appreciate fewer lightning storms in the future." "I'll see what I can do," he said solemnly, then yelped when she tickled his ribs. They wrestled playfully until they were both breathless with laughter, until the play turned to passion, until the only sound was their breathing and the endless wind outside. And afterward, falling asleep in her husband's arms, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. This was home. This was where she belonged. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with snow and bitter cold. Sarah had thought summer was hard, but winter revealed entirely new challenges. They worked in freezing temperatures to keep the cattle fed and watered, to ensure pipes didn't freeze and the animals stayed healthy. There were days when they were truly snowed in, when the world beyond the ranch house didn't exist. But instead of the isolation driving her mad as James had feared, Sarah found herself cherishing those quiet times. They read by the fire, James teaching her about animal husbandry from his father's old books. They planned improvements for the spring, sketching ideas on paper and debating the details. They learned each other even more deeply, discovering that partnership wasn't just about work, but about building a complete life together. "Tell me about Boston," James said one evening as they sat by the fire. Sarah thought back to her old life, and it felt like remembering someone else's memories. It was crowded, noisy. Everything was close together, and the air smelled like smoke and horses and too many people. I thought I loved it, but I think I just didn't know anything else. Do you miss it? Not even a little. She looked around the warm room at the life they'd built together. This is better. Hard, yes, but real. Everything here is real. In February, Martha came calling with news that the valley was growing. 3 new families had filed homestead claims on neighboring land. There would be a schoolhouse by fall, and talk of getting a proper church built. The frontier's getting civilized, Martha said with a laugh. Pretty soon we'll be respectable. God forbid, James said dryly, making the women laugh. But there was comfort in knowing they weren't quite so isolated anymore. Comfort in the idea of neighbors close enough to help if trouble came, of building a real community. The trouble, when it came, was different than expected. In March, as winter finally began loosening its grip, Sarah realized she'd missed her monthly courses, and then missed them again. When she was sick for 3 mornings straight, she knew. She was pregnant. The joy was immediate and intense, but it came with a sharp edge of fear. She thought of James's first wife, of how he'd lost both her and the baby. How could she tell him without bringing all that pain rushing back? But she'd promised no secrets between them, and she'd never break that promise. She told him that evening, simply and directly, "James, I'm going to have a baby." He froze, the color draining from his face. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought he might be angry or terrified. But then he crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she felt him trembling. "James, I know you're scared. I know what happened before. But this is different. I'm strong and healthy, and we'll get the doctor here well before the time comes. Everything will be all right." "You can't promise that." His voice was muffled against her hair. "No," she admitted. "I can't. But I can promise that I'll fight with everything I have to be here with you and our child. I can promise that this family we're building is worth fighting for." James pulled back enough to look at her, and she saw tears on his face. "I can't lose you," he said roughly. "I can't, Sarah. You're everything to me." "You won't." She cupped his face in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere. This child is going to be born right here on this ranch and grow up running through these fields and learn everything we have to teach them. We're going to raise a whole family here, James. This is just the beginning." He kissed her then, desperate and loving and grateful all at once. And when he placed his hand on her still flat belly, Sarah saw the fear in his eyes transform into hope. The months that followed were full of preparation. They converted the small bedroom into a nursery, James building a cradle from pine wood, and Sarah sewing tiny clothes. Martha coached her through what to expect, and the new doctor in town promised to be available when the time came. "You're blooming," James said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sarah was 7 months along now, round and awkward and more beautiful to him than ever. "You look like you were meant for this." "Maybe I was." Sarah rested her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "All those years in Boston, I felt like I was waiting for something without knowing what. Now I know. I was waiting for this, for you, for the life we're building together." "I never thought I'd be this happy again," James admitted. "After Anna died, I thought that was it. One chance at love and family, and I'd lost it. But you came along and turned everything upside down. In a good way, I hope." "In the best way." He leaned over to kiss her. "You gave me back my future, Sarah. You gave me back hope." The baby came in early September, on a day when the first hints of autumn were touching the air. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Sarah understood James's fear completely. But she fought through it, drawing on all the strength she'd built over these months on the ranch, and when the baby's first cry filled the room, the relief and joy were overwhelming. "A son!" the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant in Sarah's arms. James stood by the bed looking dazed and terrified and elated all at once. When Sarah held the baby out to him, he took his son with shaking hands. "He's perfect," James whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, he's perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. James looked at her, then back at the baby. "Robert, after my father, if that's all right with you." "Robert Holloway," Sarah smiled. "It's perfect." As autumn deepened into winter and Robert grew from a tiny infant into a healthy, noisy baby, Sarah often found herself standing on the porch, looking out at the land she'd claimed as her own, the land that had claimed her in return. Martha visited regularly, bringing supplies and gossip from town. The community was growing steadily now, becoming the kind of place where a child could grow up with neighbors and friends and opportunities. "You did well," Martha told Sarah one day, as they watched Robert playing on a blanket while James worked nearby. "You've built something real here." "We built it together," Sarah corrected. "James and me. That's what makes it strong." That evening, with Robert asleep in his cradle and the fire burning low, Sarah and James stood on their porch, as they so often did, looking at the land stretched out before them in the moonlight. "Remember when you first arrived?" James asked, his arm around her waist. "You looked so lost and scared." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing. And now look at you. You can rope a calf, birth a baby, and run this ranch as well as I can." He pulled her closer. "You claimed every inch of this life, just like you said you would." "We claimed it together," Sarah said. "Every inch of this land, every moment of this life. We built it together, and we'll keep building it together." "For as long as we have," James agreed. Sarah looked up at the stars, countless and brilliant in the clear Montana sky. She thought about the frightened girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach, who'd been so uncertain of everything. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. "I love you," she said to James. "I love this life. I love everything we've built and everything we're going to build. I love you too." He kissed her, sweet and lingering. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy and his impossible dream." "It wasn't impossible," Sarah said. "It was exactly what we both needed, a new beginning, a real partnership, a love that could weather anything." Inside, Robert stirred and made a small sound. They went in together to check on him, these two people who'd started as strangers and become something so much more. Partners, lovers, parents, builders of a legacy that would last for generations. Outside, the wind blew across the prairie grass, constant and eternal. The land remained, patient and vast, holding all the stories of those brave enough to claim it. And in a small ranch house in the Montana wilderness, a family slept peacefully, secure in the life they'd built together. This was home. This was forever. This was everything they'd both been searching for without knowing it. Until the day a frightened young woman stepped off a stagecoach and into the arms of a lonely cowboy who needed her just as much as she needed him. They'd claimed each other, and in doing so, claimed a future full of possibility and hope. And that, Sarah thought, as she drifted off to sleep with James's arm around her and their son breathing softly nearby, was the greatest treasure of all.